Alright, dear 1000 PS friends, our long-term test with the Speed Triple 1200 RS is coming to an end. Though to be clear, our long-term test doesn't mean we've racked up 70,000 kilometers, but that we've had it in use for a season. Why is Marcel sitting there and why am I here? Well, we were probably the ones who rode the most this year, and in this video we're going to sum up how we got on with it, what stuck in our minds. And this video should help you work out who this motorbike is the perfect choice for. Or maybe who it isn't. Yes folks, we've now got a season with the Triumph Speed Triple 1200 RS behind us. In terms of mileage, it was about 5,000 kilometers or so, right?
Yes, roughly 5,000 kilometers. We got it in April with exactly, I think, 5 kilometers on the clock. No running in, nothing at all. So yes, 5,000 kilometers in one season.
We did various things with it. We were mainly out on country roads with it. More on that in a moment. But we also spent a lot of time on the racetrack. Quite a few people from our team rode it. And I'd like to start with the country roads because personally, I think this motorbike is one of the very best hypernaked bikes for the road. And after this season, I'll quickly explain why I feel that way. The bike is relatively light. Fully fueled and ready to ride, it's around 200 kilos. Yet for a hypernaked, in my view, it hits that perfect sweet spot for power. We don't have over 200 horsepower, which might sound good at the pub, but with these 183 horsepower, we've got exactly enough for me to say, that's a lot. That's really a lot, but it's not over the top. You can more or less get it down on the road, more or less please, with electronics and good tires. But what I especially like about this bike is the mix of agility, stability, and usable torque. From low down right up top, and you don't have to squeeze all 183 horsepower out of it to have fun because the bike still works. It works at lower speeds in a higher gear just fine. Marcel, you spent a lot of time on it as well. What stood out to you about this bike?
Basically the agility and the genuinely usable everyday side of it. Because as we've just said, hyper-naked bike, 180 horsepower, on paper, that doesn't exactly scream that you'd still ride it on country roads nowadays. The rules keep getting stricter, the laws ever tougher. Yet it still works. There are motorbikes with outrageous power figures on paper that are, in practice, relatively rideable. Especially on the road within legal limits, I should add. And those are usually bikes with big capacity and fewer cylinders. And that's where the Triumph hits a pretty perfect sweet spot. We often talk about the Super Duke, which with a twin is brilliant on the road. Then we often mention, for example, the Aprilia Tuono or Kawasaki, 4 cylinders accordingly, which want revs, more of a track thing. But Triumph has really nailed it with these triples, especially the large capacity triple in the 1200, hitting a proper sweet spot. On track, you never feel like, wow, I'd like 2,000 more revs. And you never feel on the road that you have to wind it out to 8,000 just to get anything from it. That's exactly the point. The smaller Triumph doesn't have that. You have to rev it extremely hard. It really only comes alive from 6,000 RPM, and then it's great fun, but down low, it's genuinely tough. And the big one simply hits that sweet spot so that even though it's got 180 horsepower, it still rides brilliantly on country roads.
A very good comparison with the Street Triple RS because there were quite a few people commenting under the videos. We've published loads of videos with this motorbike this year and written test reports too. And the feedback, I wouldn't call it criticism, but the remark from the community kept coming up. Well, the Street Triple RS is actually more than enough for country roads. And you've got a point there. That's also true to a degree, but you put it well. The big difference between the two bikes is simply that extra punch. And by that, I don't mean top-end power. I really mean the torque that comes along from low down. Because as you rightly said, the Street Triple RS is a proper filleting tool. Essentially a classic supersport motorbike with a very peaky power delivery, great suspension, great handling, extremely precise. theoretically it's totally sufficient for the road, because what more than 130 horsepower do you really need? But it's that meaty shove that's missing. And the Speed Triple, the big sister, as you rightly say, has it in every situation. So you don't get that thing the smaller one has, where it's a bit flat down low. And as you say, once you're into the mid-revs, it wakes up and it's fun. But if you miss a shift or something, especially in tight, twisty sections, it gets a bit laborious. And that, in my view, is where the Speed Triple rules. Whether you're a gear too high doesn't matter at all. The triple hauls you out of there. And on top of that, I think it's got an okay sound. Not super epic, but it's a nice, solid sound. Above all, it's beautifully connected to the throttle. No matter which riding mode you're in, it's really well calibrated these days. That means with the throttle, and with the clutch too, you can meter the bike wonderfully, even in very tight hairpins. And that, I think, is what matters far more on the road. Rideability and accessibility rather than top-end power or an especially peaky character. I think the Speed Triple 1200 RS, as you rightly said, is a lovely blend of different worlds. And for us everyday riders who might do a track day now and then, but spend most of the time on country roads in the city in mixed conditions, it's actually positioned extremely cleverly.
And it has to be said, that really comes from people in the company like us. We're the ones who always say 120 horsepower is plenty. Almost 100, really. But 120 is absolutely enough for the road. But there are still motorbikes and there are scenarios, as I'll mention later when I was riding in Sardinia, where that extra power simply gives you a benefit in terms of fun. You genuinely have more fun. Even if you think, well, you can't really use more than 130 horsepower on the road, but the torque and the bigger engine, and usually the components you get on the pricier, larger capacity bikes, that whole combination still makes it more fun. Even if up top it's of course far too much power and you really only need 2 gears, but that torque from low revs is always something that brings fun on the road, and you feel that at 50 kilometers per hour and you feel it at 150 kilometers per hour. And with the triple, it's simply the golden mean. I did notice on the tour that at 3000, under 3000 RPM, it doesn't really want to, not entirely. So it's not like a proper Kawasaki 4-cylinder or 4s in general, where you ride everything in 6th gear. There are more refined engines that run a bit calmer down low. I'd almost say it's like a twin under 3000. I noticed that in the hairpins. But from 3000 RPM, the engine runs brilliantly, and up top, there's basically no limit. And then that's that.
I see it pretty much the same way. I'd also say the Speed Triple is, although by definition a hypernaked bike, actually the more practical one, or even the first truly everyday usable hypernaked bike for me. Also because of the ergonomics. You're about 188 centimeters tall, and I'm 185. And I think each of us sat extremely well on this motorbike. You sit rather upright for a hyper-naked bike. Something like the Street Fighter 5.4 or the Tuono V4 leans you much further forward. You definitely catch a lot of wind, that has to be said. We also didn't have the fly screen on our model, so we got the full wind blast. But the riding position was fine for you, fine for me, and fine for all the others. I never heard anything negative about the seating position.
Absolutely suitable for long distances as well. With my height, I really sit quite upright, and I was genuinely surprised. I could easily go touring on it, and that's how it was. On my tour, over 5 days we covered 1,400 kilometers. And anyone who's been riding in Sardinia knows that those 1,400 kilometers are like 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers in terms of effort here in Austria. So yes, ergonomics, you really can't complain. If you like that feeling of sitting a bit further back from the front wheel, not right on top of it, with a slightly livelier front end, especially when you open the throttle uphill, if that's your thing, you'll be absolutely happy with the Triumph.
Let's also talk about the electronic suspension it has. And here too, I have to say, I think Triumph has really done everything right. Öhlins suspension, latest generation electronic system. What stood out to both of us, I think, is this huge range it offers. You can ride it on track and get nice feedback. But what I find far more important is that you can also ride it in the city and on your secondary country roads without it beating you up, without having to adjust God knows how many settings. Because even in automatic mode, in my view, you already have such a good range in there. What do you think?
Yes, I have to say the suspension was my absolute highlight. Of course, people always talk about the engine, and the suspension isn't something Triumph alone is responsible for, because obviously it comes from Öhlins. The calibration is probably done by Triumph together with Öhlins, but you simply have to say, if you spend more money, you get the best. And you really notice it, because on my tour in Sardinia, I briefly rode a 1290 Super Duke and a Tuono, and it was clear that this Öhlins suspension reacts completely differently. It's just as firm as those two, but you don't feel surface irregularities directly through the handlebars. And it's a bit like magic. It really feels like a bit of wizardry, because normally a suspension that soaks up everything, or almost everything, especially on a sports motorbike, usually isn't this firm. At least I notice it. I'm not a professional. But for me, it's always those quick direction changes, those tight left-right transitions, where I can tell if a suspension is working or getting unsettled. And this one stays completely stable. Then you ride over a bump and you don't feel anything unpleasant through the seat. That was my absolute highlight. Yes, the suspension is top.
I think we can also say the brakes were more than good. The braking performance is exactly what you'd expect in this class. And it's good you mentioned it. What you actually get besides more horsepower when you buy the bigger model is simply more equipment. As you say, fully electronic, modern suspension. Personally, I'm a huge fan because I love that wide range of adjustability. You can achieve that with a mechanical suspension too, but here it's just much more comfortable. I don't have to fiddle around much. I just make 2 or 3 clicks and I'm done. That, for me, is perhaps the biggest benefit when spending more money. I'm buying myself more comfort without losing performance.
Yes, that was another thing I noticed. When I first sat on it, the suspension felt a bit strange, very stiff and all that. So I went into the settings and saw that you can apparently adjust the suspension to your weight, and our colleague Alessio had ridden it before on track, and suddenly the weight setting was at 58 kilos. He's got a MotoGP figure, as people like to say. So I adjusted it and added almost 30 kilos, and it rode completely differently. And I thought that was just a few clicks. Of course, you can adjust everything else too. And the fact that any layperson can sit on it and get it set up almost perfectly, that's what you're paying for.
Since you mentioned adjusting things, I think there is one criticism we both share: the menu navigation, or rather the control layout. In my opinion, as great as the Triumph is, and I honestly think it has hardly any weaknesses, the menu system, the control concept, that's where it falls short for me. I didn't find it intuitive at all, and I never really got along with it because I never quite knew what I was supposed to do next. I mean, I haven't read the manual, we just sit on it and try things out. And I have to say that's the only real shame about this motorbike. I think it deserved a better user interface. What do you think?
Yes, it really feels like a smartphone from 10 years ago that starts stuttering the moment you open Internet Explorer or the browser or Chrome. And it's a pity because you start the bike, then you wait a good 10 seconds before you can even do anything. Then you want to change something in the menus and you instantly notice how the whole menu starts lagging. The animations are nicely done, but they're not the clearest, I have to say. I'm not a big fan of Triumph's display layouts. You can choose several views, but I find all of them a bit too cluttered. And sometimes it's like this. You've got this nice 5-inch display, and then all the information is squeezed into this round rev counter that doesn't even fill the whole display. It's just this little circle. And then I think, why have such a nicely animated design if it doesn't even use the full screen? And overall, it's just not very clear. And the performance isn't great either. Maybe part of that is user error, but for example, every time I started the bike, it kept switching back to road mode instead of, say, sport mode. And it's not as if you can just set that somewhere. At least I didn't find it during all the coffee breaks I had. So every time you stop, you have to press 2 buttons again to get out of road mode, and that happens 3 or 4 times a day. Especially when the display starts lagging again, you just think, this is annoying, others really do it better. But honestly, the bike itself is so good. It's such a small criticism. You deal with it once a day and that's it. The next generation will probably sort it out. It's not a big issue. I think it's easily fixed. A technician or software engineer just needs to sit down and sort it. But yes, most other brands unfortunately do this better.
So that's maybe a little homework we can give Triumph in this video. Please bring your user interface into the year 2025 or 2026. There's still room for improvement. You already mentioned you were in Sardinia, and that was towards the end of our long-term test. Tell us briefly, why did you choose the Speed Triple 1200 RS to go to Sardinia? What tires did you have on it? How did that combination work? And would you do it again?
Basically, I wanted a powerful naked bike. I've already been down there with other bikes, and every year, at the end of the season, we go to Sardinia. That's our season finale. And naturally, you want to see what we have available in the company. That's the first criterion. What can you borrow, so to speak? And because you have to reserve things a bit in advance, because someone like Niels might show up and say, right, I'm taking that bike now, and then it's gone. You have to secure it 3 months ahead. And for me, it was clear. I want the Speed Triple. It's pretty much the most radical long-term test bike we've had this year. I wanted to try it. I know how it feels on our local roads, but what's it like down there, really riding it in those conditions? So what's it like in Sardinia on that super grippy asphalt with 30 degrees every day and, well, only moderate speed enforcement? What's it like? There you can really choose your pace. So what's it like riding around with 180 horsepower down there? And because we go down with the trailer, the tire question was easy. I don't need a tire that lasts the whole trip there and back. I need a sports tire that simply survives 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers down there and is done afterwards. So we fitted a Dunlop Sportsmart MK4, new this year, to test it. It was completely new 2 weeks before I left, and then came a track day where Alessio, the colleague I mentioned earlier, did 7 sessions on track with it over 2 days. Absolutely mad. Yes, and the tire still looked decent afterwards. So I took my little measuring tool and checked it, and there was still around 4 to 4.5 millimeters at the rear and 4 millimeters at the front. That should be enough, even if things get tough for the tire. And then we headed down there and rode about 13 to 1400 kilometers. And afterwards, the rear tire was completely done. Totally bald, as they say, but the front still had loads left, easily 3 millimeters of tread.
So you needed to ride more on the front wheel, just have to
Push it in, exactly. No, but of course down there the corners are insanely grippy and you want to pull power out of every corner. And you're not exactly gentle on the throttle. You open it up and the rear tire just disappears. But what you really can say is that it was the perfect combination. This 3-cylinder engine with torque down low and the tire that basically never slipped or gave any uncertainty. And on top of that, it even enhanced the agile handling even more. Because that's also a thing. If you pick a tire that maybe suits another motorbike better, it changes everything. Here it was, the perfect bike for the perfect tire. Super agile. And then we did the 1200 kilometers down there, came back, and there's not much more to say.
Right, then I'll give you a bit from the racetrack as well, because we were out there with various hypernaked bikes at the Slovakiaring. We had the Supercorsa SP V4 fitted, a hardcore sport tire that's really meant for track days. And that was very interesting because we had an S1000RR, a Street Fighter 5.4 S and the Tuono 1100 factory with us. So basically the finest machinery at the Slovakiaring with Martin Bauer. Max was there as well, Lena too. We really went for it. And I have to say, that's where you first start to feel the differences between these hypernaked bikes. Because as you mentioned, the Speed Triple's agility is outstanding on the road. But on a fast circuit like the Slovakiaring, those differences become apparent, especially in turn 2, for example, a very fast right kink. You're going through there at over 2G. And that's when you notice, okay, the slightly more upright seating position, the more agile chassis concept, you don't get quite as much feedback from the front. It doesn't sit in the corner quite as planted as the Street Fighter V4S or the Tuono, though to be fair, those two are really the benchmark. You can feel that those two bikes come from super bikes that have been made into naked bikes, whereas the Speed Triple 1200 RS, in my view, is a pure naked bike. That's exactly how the engineers in Hinckley have always approached it, I think. And that's why on the road, in everyday use, for me, it simply works best out of all these hyper-naked bikes. And yes, I know there are lots of people out there who decide based on the datasheet what sets the fastest lap time on track. And honestly, if that's how you want to make your decision, that's fine. But I don't think that should be the main criterion when choosing a bike like this. How many track days do you ride per year? And even on a track day, if I really wanted to set the fastest lap, I wouldn't necessarily show up on a naked bike. A small super bike would be the better choice. I'd focus more on what I really need day to day, what I ride most. And I think all of us ride, 90% or more on country roads. And that's where the Speed Triple RS lives. That's where it belongs, in my opinion. And there it's almost undisputedly number one if I take all parameters into account. I also think the value for money is really quite good. You get a lot of motorbike for what you pay, and you don't have to buy extra packs afterwards like with some manufacturers. It comes fully loaded straight from the factory and off you go. I find that very appealing about this bike. And now I'll say something as a Ducati Street Fighter 5.4 owner, and it doesn't come easy. But I really have to admit, I've genuinely fallen in love with the Speed Triple this year, to the point where I briefly considered giving up my Street Fighter. Because the engine really is better suited to the road, you've got the power exactly where you need it. On the aux saddle, you're starving with the V4 because you're always in first gear, since it only really makes power up top. And down low it's rough, and with the Speed Triple you just draw this lovely smooth line, almost like on a GS. And what I think is brilliant, Triumph, you did everything right here. You kept the single-sided swing arm.
I find it stunning. I don't actually think the whole bike is beautiful in the crystal sense, but I think it's cool. I like that insect-like look, that masculine beefy stance, but not
Clumsy.
exactly. I really have to say, I did think about it. I admit it. I genuinely considered it. Would you buy it privately?
Well, I'll put it this way. For me, 23,000 euros, which it costs in Austria,
24,000.
euros for a motorbike just isn't worth it.
No. But if I had the money and it was worth it to me, then yes, absolutely. Because in that class, and many people in the comments bring this up, when they talk about reliability with Triumph, I simply have the feeling, and its history shows it too, that there's very little to complain about. The engine has no issues, certainly not in our 5,000 kilometers, and on my tour as well, there were never any problems. Basically, the thing is reliable. The engine is reliable, everything on it gives you that feeling of being well built and high quality. You get something similar from other manufacturers too, but you always hear things in the comments or in the forums, or they are more expensive, exactly. Because we also have to say, 24,000 euros is a lot of money, yes, but compared to the competition, it's actually okay. Especially considering you get Öhlins suspension, the latest of the latest. So yes, for someone who mainly rides country roads and maybe wants to try a track day once, it's perfectly suitable. It's just tiring because of the lack of wind protection. Totally fine. And for the roads, as a road bike, if you want displacement, if you want big capacity and torque.
And what's always a good indicator, okay, we've seen it at the track days, it was at almost every track day and people always wanted to ride the Speed Triple. Whether it was Amelie, Alessio, us, there was always this pull. I want to ride the Speed Triple. Because it's just so easy to ride in my view. It's always hard to explain. But you sit on it and you instantly know how to ride this bike. It doesn't have complicated handling. The engine isn't tuned in a complicated way. It's cleanly set up. The suspension works, the steering works. Even though it's a muscle bike, it's beautifully easy to ride. And I absolutely love that.
Of course, modern bikes are like that in general. All modern bikes are more and more built with that in mind, and they have to improve somewhere. And the improvements nowadays, you can say across the board, are that they're easy to ride and accessible for everyone. Even a 200 horsepower bike these days, all those 200 horsepower bikes are relatively easy to ride.
All right, folks, I think we'll leave it there. We've talked a lot. My mouth's getting dry. I hope we were able to give you some orientation with our end of season long-term test wrap-up of the Triumph Speed Triple 1200 RS, who the bike is for and who it maybe isn't for. Triumph will hopefully improve the controls and the display, and then we'll all be happy. And with that, thanks for watching. Bye.